In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the Linux command line interface. If you're working in the IT field and you need to administrate Linux servers, being comfortable with the Linux command line interface is an essential IT skill. Whether it's cloud servers or on-premises servers, or maybe it's your own lab environment, you're going to need to be familiar with typing commands at a Linux CLI. And that's what I'm going to try and do for you in this video. I'm going to get you setting up your own IT lab, which is going to run on VirtualBox. So we're going to download VirtualBox. It's free software. It runs on Windows and it runs on Linux. We're going to download Ubuntu Server, which is a CLI-based version or distribution of Linux. We'll install that. Then we'll talk about some basic Linux commands. We're going to stick to around 10 or 12 commands that I think you should know if it was day one and I was teaching you about Linux. After that, we'll talk about the Linux file system hierarchy, just so you know how to navigate around the Linux file system and you're able to get to configuration files and know where logs are and things like that. So by the end of this video, you're going to have your own IT lab up and running with Linux installed, and you'll be ready to mess around with Linux and start to get comfortable with the command line interface with the Linux shell. If you're interested in learning more about Linux, I recommend that you create a free account at serveracademy.com. That is our company. We offer a free Linux fundamentals course where you'll get pretty much what we're going to cover in this video, but it'll be broken up into smaller chunks. And there'll be lessons that you can mark as complete. There'll be quizzes, and there's IT labs that run in your browser, so you wouldn't have to set up VirtualBox. We also have a full Linux server administration course that goes into a lot more detail on all these topics. And we have things like Ansible, and we'll be bringing more Linux-based courses in the future. So definitely check that out. All right, so let's get started. And the first thing we need to check is that we have the ability to run virtual machines on our computer. That means you need a somewhat modern computer. You want to have at least 4 gigs of RAM available on your host computer. I'd really recommend 8. And you want to have at least 4 CPUs. That just means we need to be able to assign at least 2 gigs of RAM to our virtual machine and at least 2 CPUs to our virtual machine. Next, for hard drive space, we want to have at least 40 gigabytes available. You can get away with closer to 20, but you might start running into issues if you only have 20 gigs available. So check your computer, make sure you have enough space before you proceed. Now, if you're running an Intel processor, you want to make sure that you have VT-X turned on. That is Intel's virtualization technology. And if you're on an AMD processor, you need to have AMD-V enabled. Of course, that's AMD's equivalent virtualization technology. One thing I want to point out is that if you run into issues while you're trying to start your virtual machine, you may need to just enable virtualization in your BIOS or UEFI. Now, to do that is going to be different. It's going to vary from computer to computer. And I can't show you all the possible combinations that there could be for enabling virtualization. So I would just Google your computer hardware and how to enable virtualization, and you'll find a guide to show you how to turn it on. Okay, so I'm here on my computer. The first thing we want to do is let's just go to google.com and let's just Google search VirtualBox download. And I'm going to click on this first link here, which is downloads. And then I'm going to select the appropriate download for my operating system. Now, I'm on a Windows computer, so I'll select Windows host. If you're on Mac, you can do that here. If you're on Linux already, you could select that here. Now I'll click Windows, and that's going to start the download up here in the top right-hand corner. Okay, so now if I click up here, I can see VirtualBox is downloaded. So I'm just going to start that by just clicking on it, and I'll get the user access control prompt, and I'll just select yes. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and close this web browser, and I'm going to proceed with the default settings here. There's no need to customize this installation. So I'll just click next, and I'll say yes. I want to add the network interfaces, and I'll keep continuing, and I'll just press install. So I'm just going to wait for this installation to finish. What I'm going to do is speed up this video. So if you're following along, just go ahead and pause the video and we'll come back once the installation is complete. Okay, so now the installation is complete. So I'm going to click finish. Now, before we proceed any further, we need to go back to our browser, and I'm just going to pop that back open here. And we need to go back to Google. We need to download our Linux distribution that we want. So I'm just going to go to Google and just type in Ubuntu server download, and I'll press enter. Now, the first link we have is get Ubuntu server. And this is the Linux distribution that I'm going to use. So I'm going to select download 2404 LTS, which is LTS stands for long-term support. And that is going to begin that download that I'll see up here in the top right-hand corner. So I can see the download is now proceeding. If you want to use a different distribution, you are free to do that. Just keep in mind that there may be variances in the commands that I'm telling you to do, especially when we get to installing the operating system. We're going to update it, and I'm going to use the apt package manager. So if you download CentOS, for example, you won't find that apt is there, right? They use yum or DNF, for example. Just keep in mind that between Linux distributions, there are small variances between the Linux commands. Just so if some of the commands aren't working and you chose a different Linux distribution, just look up the equivalent for your Linux distribution. Okay, so now that that's downloading, I'm going to go ahead and just close my browser. And I'm going to go back to VirtualBox. So now that we have VirtualBox installed and we have our ISO or our ISO for our Linux distribution downloaded, let's create a virtual machine and configure it. So I'm going to select machine in the top left corner and I'll select new. I like to go to expert mode. So what I'm going to do is just click this button down here, and that just gives me everything on less pages essentially. So this is how I prefer to make my VMs. So what I'm going to do is just name my server Ubuntu server, just so I know what it is and I don't get confused. So under ISO images, we need to select the ISO that we just downloaded. So I'll click this drop down and I'll select other, and I'll click the ISO and then I'll click open. Next, I'm going to say skip unattended installation. This will allow us to go through the installation ourselves, which is important if we're trying to learn Linux. So we're going to skip over this unattended install tab, and under hardware, you want to do really at least 2 CPUs and at least 2 gigabytes of RAM. I'm going to bump this up because I can, and I'm going to drag this right to 4096. That's about 4 gigabytes of RAM allocated to my virtual machine. And you know what? Why not? I'll just go 4 CPUs as well. Now, if you can only do 2 and 2, that's fine as well. But since I have plenty of processing power to give, I'm going to go ahead and do that. It'll make my installation a little bit faster. For hard disks, I'm going to type in 80 and then delete 25, and that will make my hard disk 80 gigabytes in size. 25, I believe, is around the minimum for Ubuntu server. It may be 20 gigabytes of space, but we want to install updates. You may want to install applications or server software on this VM. So I would recommend at least going with 40 if you can. I'm going to go with 80 just so I don't have to worry about expanding the disk later. I'll go ahead and click finish, and that's going to create the virtual machine. The next thing that we're going to need to do is modify the virtual machine's network settings. So now that that's done, let's right click on the VM and let's choose settings. And I'm going to go down to the network tab, and the only thing we're going to change is from NAT, we're going to change this to bridged adapter. And what this is going to allow us to do, allows our host computer, the computer that I'm currently using here that you're seeing on your screen, to pass network traffic to the virtual machine. And that will allow me to SSH from my host computer directly into the virtual machine. If we were to leave this on NAT, I would not be able to reach from my host computer into the VM, which is what I want to do to SSH to it. All right. This just allows us to avoid doing things like having to stick to the VirtualBox console, which is great, but it's not the best user experience. So I prefer bridged adapter. I'll go ahead and click OK. By the way, bridged adapter is also good if you want to do things like set up a web server or maybe email server that you want to be accessible on your local network. You're going to want to do bridged, right? You only want to do NAT if you want the VM to only communicate with the internet. So now I'm going to right click the VM and I'm going to say start, and I'll just say normal start. And we're just going to wait a second for the VM to power up, and the VM console will appear on the screen shortly. So here it is in the bottom right corner. I'm just going to go ahead and click that. And I'm going to click out of this pop-up here, and I'm going to click in the middle of the screen. And you'll notice now my cursor is gone, but if I press the up arrow and down arrow, I can move around inside this installation. So I'm going to say try or install Ubuntu server, and I'll press enter. Now, one thing I want to point out, I'm going to be skipping ahead and fast forwarding through this video. I'll show you all the steps. I also don't want to get into all the details of, why we're configuring things in different ways, just because this is an introductory video into Linux. If you want more in-depth details, then you should sign up for a course or maybe take a Linux certification, for example. In this video, I want to make it as entry level and as user friendly, or beginner friendly as possible. So if I'm not explaining every little detail, that's the reason. I don't want this to be hard to digest. I want it to be just an easy introductory video into the Linux CLI. All right, it's already hard enough without me explaining, overloading you with tons of information. So what's going on right now is it's loading the installer and getting ready so that we can install Ubuntu server on our VM here. Okay, so now we're presented with the VM installer. So again, we have no mouse input into this. We're going to use the keyboard. So we're going to press up and down, and I'm going to use English for my language, and I'll press enter. And you can change the layout if you'd like. I don't need to do any of that. We really don't need to customize any of these settings in the beginning here. So we're just going to click done, and we're going to say Ubuntu server. Now, one thing I want to point out is that minimized is a very stripped down runtime where you're not expected to be logging into the server. That's not what we want to do, right? So we want to do Ubuntu server. So we'll go ahead and click done. And this just gives me an insight into what my IP address is. Now, I will want to note that I see it's 192.168.1.166. I am going to write that down because we're going to be SSHing into this server later. So what I'm going to do is open Notepad. And I'll drag this over here, and I'm just going to write down this IP address, 192.168.1.166. So when I SSH into the server, that's going to be the IP address that I SSH into. So I'll just drag that off my screen, and we'll go ahead and just click done. And we're going to click done again because we're not going to be doing any of these proxies. I don't need to wait for this mirror to complete. So I'll just click done, and I will say continue, even though the mirror check is still in progress. I want to use the entire hard disk, all 80 gigabytes that we created. So I'll click done. And this automatically creates the partitions for me. No need to customize any of this. It will use the whole hard disk since we specified that earlier. So I'll go ahead and click done. And it's saying, hey, before you write these volumes and partitions and things like that, it's a destructive action, right? That's okay because there's no data on this virtual machine. So we'll just go ahead and say, yes, continue. Now on this screen, we're going to want to enter our own information on what we'll use to log into the server. So I'm just going to say my name is Paul and my server name is going to be Ubuntu-server. I like to match this with what I have in VirtualBox just so there's never any confusion. Now for a username, I'll use my first name and last initial. And for password, for these labs, I always do password lowercase and then 123. You can make yours whatever you want, just don't forget it. So I'll press down arrow and go to done and press enter. And we're not going to do Ubuntu Pro. We're just going to hit continue. And right here, I want to make sure that I install OpenSSH. This is why we chose a bridged adapter, because SSHing into the server versus using this console experience that we're using right now is much preferred. And you'll understand that later. So let's go ahead and just say done. And we're not going to install any of these packages, but if you want any of these packages like the Google Cloud SDK, maybe you're doing Google Cloud work, you can hit spacebar and turn those on here. I'm going to skip all of this. Another popular one would be Docker. If you're running containers or you want to learn about how to use containers, you can install Docker here. You can also do this later, so there's no need to do it now. We'll just go ahead and click done. And now it's going to proceed with the installation. If we want, we can view the full log. And if we want to back out of this screen, we just hit close. What we're going to do now is just wait for this installation to finish. So again, this is where it's going to be processing for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to speed up this video. So if you're following along, just pause the video and we'll come back once the installation is complete. Okay, so my installation is now complete. So what I'm going to do is click the down arrow and say reboot now. Now, at the time of this recording, there's some type of issue with VirtualBox removing the installation media. And we're going to see that here in the top left corner where it says failed unmounting the cd-rom.mount/cd-rom. So press enter. So it's going to fail this twice. What I'm going to do is just press enter like it says, and the machine will reboot and it will dismount the CD-ROM. So you don't need to actually go to devices up here and dismount the optical drive. It'll do that for you. Just press enter and it'll reboot and we'll start to be prepared to log into the machine. So at this point, we're going to wait for the VM to boot up and then we'll try to access our new Linux server. Okay, so here I am at my Linux server login. And you'll notice this is the thing about Linux servers. There's no graphical user interface. And this is what scares off a lot of IT professionals. And I'm here to tell you, this actually is pretty easy to learn, right? It looks intimidating because you only have text and you think you have to memorize all these commands. And while that is true, it's actually pretty intuitive. And you'll find that you're able to work much faster at a Linux shell than you are on a Windows desktop where you're having to click around on different things. There's also a lot of benefits when it comes to automation and things like that. But primarily, this is a much lighter operating system than that like Windows Server, right? It's just a lot less needs to be installed and it takes a lot less processing power to run this server. So what we can do here is we can just type in our username, Paul H, which is what I use, and type in my password, press enter, and I will log into the server. Now, the first thing I'm going to look for here, because what I want to do is get away from this VirtualBox console, and I want to SSH from my Windows command prompt, or you could use PuTTY or whatever client you prefer. But I'm looking at the IP address here and I see mine is still what I wrote down earlier. And it's important just to confirm that because DHCP can change your IP address when you restart the computer. So what I see here is it's still 192.168.1.166. So what I'm going to do now is just go back here and I'm going to say exit and it's going to log me out of the virtual machine. Now let's minimize VirtualBox and leave that running in the background. I'm going to select my IP address and copy it, and I'll minimize this and I'll minimize VirtualBox. Now let's go and hit start, and I'm going to type in CMD and I'm going to open this. All right, now let's go ahead and just maximize the screen. And for you guys, I know this is going to be hard to see, so I'm going to hold left control and just scroll up, and that'll zoom in the text here. And I'm going to type in SSH and press enter. And what you should get is the usage for SSH or secure shell. And this means that you have SSH installed on your computer. Now, I'm on Windows, and all modern versions of Windows include things like SSH. And if I press SEP, I can get that, which is how you copy files to and from a Linux server, uh, or between Linux servers, whatever the case may be. You can do it from Windows to Linux and things like that. Uh, we're going to SSH from our host computer into our Linux server. The reason why we're going to do it this way is this is how you will be accessing production IT infrastructure that is Linux based. More likely, you will not be RDPing or XRDPing into the server. You're just going to SSH, type some commands, install software, update the VM, and then you're going to exit or log out of the server. So this is why I'm showing it to you this way. So also, there's some benefits of doing this over the VirtualBox console. If you remember, if I go to VirtualBox, I can't click inside of this. So there's no ability for me to copy and paste any data. If I do this from command prompt, however, I can drag and select things all that I want, and I can copy and paste. So if I'm using ChatGPT, I can copy and paste from ChatGPT and paste it into my lab VM and execute commands and things like that. Not that I'm recommending you let ChatGPT administrate your IT systems, but while you're learning, it can help, right? So what I'm going to do is just type in SSH and Paul H, which is my username, and I'm going to say @ and I'll paste by right clicking the IP address that I copied earlier. This is the IP address of my Linux server. So I'm SSHing into Paul H, my username, at 192.168.1.166. Now, of course, your IP address for your server is going to be different than mine, but this is just an example. You have to replace the username and the IP address with your values. So I'll press enter. And what we should get is, hey, we don't know. SSH is telling you this server has never been connected to, and do you trust it? What I'm going to say is yes, because this is the VM that I just created, and I'll press enter. And it says that it permanently added that server to my list of known hosts. You'll learn about that later. If you take our Linux server administration course, I break this down. But what we're just going to do is, understand that, hey, now that server is recognized as a server we've connected to before. So we shouldn't expect that prompt again. I'm going to type in my password, which is just password123, and I'll press enter. And I'll press enter again. And what I get is the same output, but what you'll notice, I can scroll up and down. I can drag select different values. Like if I drag select my, let's not do that. Let's do drag select this command here, man sudo root. And I right click 2 times, it will copy and paste that, and I can press enter, right? And this opens the man help for sudo root. So what I'm going to do is just hit Q to quit that. One thing I want to talk about really quick is how to get help. So if I'm trying to type a command like ps and I don't know what arguments to use, I can do ps-help and press enter, and it's going to give me output on how to use the command. Most of the time, you can do --help and you can get help on different commands that you're trying to run. We can also use the man command or manual, and I can say man ps, and this will give us kind of like a little handbook on how to use this command line utility. So I can use the up and down arrows. I can use page up and page down, and I can search through this document and try to find helpful information to understand how to use this command. I'll press Q to quit that. So this is how you're going to interact with Linux server infrastructure most of the time in the IT field, whether it's in the cloud or it's on premises, or like in our case, in our lab environment, it's going to be just like this. So when you install Linux for the very first time, the first thing we want to do is update and upgrade everything. So we're going to use what's called the sudo command. Before I do that, I'm going to type in clear and press enter, and that just clears my screen so there's not too much going on and things don't get too confusing. Another thing that I like to do is press F11 on my Windows computer, and that will bump me into full screen mode. And I can do left control and zoom in a little bit more and make the text a little bit bigger for you to read. So that might have been a little bit too much. We'll go right there. Hopefully that's good and easy for you all to read. What we're going to do is say sudo, which is super user do. It's like running things as an administrator or with elevated permissions. And I'm going to say apt update, and I'll press enter. It's going to ask me for my user's password, and I'll type in password123. And what it's going to do is go out to all of these repositories, and it's going to look for things that can be updated. Now, what it's telling me here is that 44 packages can be upgraded. And then it says I can run this command, which again, we're going to just drag select, right click twice and press enter. And this will list all 44 packages that can be upgraded. And I can scroll up to look at all that information. We don't really care that much. We're just going to upgrade our server. So we'll say sudo apt upgrade. And it's not going to prompt me for my password again because it still remembers the password that I entered before. And it says, do you want to continue? Here are the packages that are going to be installed. So we could scroll up and look at all of these. I'm sorry, these are the packages that are going to be upgraded. and I'm going to say Y for yes, and I'll press enter, and it's going to start upgrading the server. I'm actually going to zoom out just a little bit so that we can have a little bit more text on the screen, because I feel like it's kind of wrapping too much. So this is going through the upgrade process and getting our server fully patched and up to date. So again, this is going to take a few minutes. So I'm just going to pause or speed up this video. You should just pause your video and come back once your upgrade is complete. All right, so it looks like the upgrade has completed. So all of that is good. We have some information about services that were restarted, some services that were services that were deferred. The restarts were being deferred. Uh, Again, I don't want to go into every single detail here. This is a beginner video, so we're just going to try and keep it as simple as we can. Now, one thing that I want to talk about, I should have talked about as soon as we logged in, is just what are we looking at here in our Linux prompt, right? First, we have our username that we're logged in as, right? This helps us understand what user we're typing commands as. Then we have the @ sign, which separates the username from the host name. And this is the host name of our computer. So our computer is Ubuntu-server. And if we type in host name and press enter, we'll get the output Ubuntu server, right? We have a colon, which separates us from our current directory. And the current directory is this little tilde character, which means we are in our user's home directory. This tilde character, if I hold shift and hit the backtick, it will output that same character. This is a special character for my home directory, right? If I was to type in pwd, which is present working directory, and press enter, I'm going to see that directory is actually /home/paulh. Then we have the $sign. And what that means is that our shell is ready to accept commands from the user. And that's how we're typing in commands. Like we can type in who am I to see the output of our current user. And we get Paul H as the output. That $sign just means that the terminal is ready to accept commands. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the Linux commands that you need to know, that you have to know. If it was day one and I was teaching you Linux commands, these are probably the first 10 or so, or 12 maybe, that I would show you. This list is not perfect at all. So what I'm asking for those of you who are more experienced with Linux, or maybe you know a handful of commands, please share those in the comments, because I can't cover everything and it might help if they're able to read them. Again, by the time I upload this video, I'll probably think of more commands or rearrange the order, or maybe remove some commands in favor for others. This is not a definitive list by any stretch of the imagination. These are the bare basics to get you started in moving around the Linux operating system or your Linux distribution so that you can do different things. So to get started, the first thing we're going to talk about is ls, right? So if I want to list my current directory's contents, I'm going to just type in ls and press enter. This is going to list all the files in my current directory. Now, I don't see any files because this is a brand new user and a brand new VM, and I haven't put anything there. But I can do things like ls-la or -a and press enter, and this will list all hidden files. So there's some hidden files inside of my directory that I can see when I do that. If I want it in list format, I just add a L for ls-la, and that means list and show all files, and I'll get that in a list format. I can also do things like ll and press enter, and I get essentially the same thing. Now, we talked about our home directory and the pwd command. Now, how do you actually move around the file system? And that's with the cd or change directory command. So if I want to go back one directory, I can see that I'm under the root, I'm under the home directory, and the Paul H directory. If I want to go back one directory to home, I'm just going to say cd ... and I can press enter. Now we'll see that this whole path has updated to say that I'm n/home. So if I type in pwd and press enter, I'll see that now I'm in the home directory, right? If I ls this directory, I'll see Paul H. If I want to go back to Paul H, I say cd Paul H, press enter, and now it says, hey, you're back in your home directory. Now, one thing I want to talk about is tab completion. Something that I just did there and thought about, I need to talk about this. I'll cd back, or actually let's just type in the full path /home and press enter. You'll see we're back in the /home directory. If I ls this directory, I have the directory Paul H. If I want to cd to that, I can type in cd and I can type in Paul H, or I can start to type the command and finish it by pressing tab, and it will automatically input whatever possible option I had. So I'll just press enter, and it's a little bit quicker of a way to get around. Now, if we say cd/ and I press tab now, what it's going to do is list out all the possible options. And if I type in B, for example, I can press tab, double tap tab, and I'll see, oh, all the directories that are under the root that start with a B is bin, bin user is merged, and boot, right? So if I do I and press tab, it's going to autocomplete the next little bit of that. And if I double tap tab, now I'm limiting down the amount of things that I can type in. So this is called tab completion. If you're not sure about your command, try using tab completion to get it to automatically type things for you or present options that you can use at the command line interface. Okay, so let's go ahead and just talk about the Nano editor. Now, editing text files in on Linux can be challenging because you don't have a user interface. Nano is the beginner, the most beginner text editor that you can use. It's sometimes even frowned upon because it's so easy to use, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. It's a great editor. So what we're going to do is use the command nano, and we're going to hit space and type in the name of the file that we either want to edit or we want to create. Let's make a file called file.txt, right? And I'm just going to say, this is my file. Oh, not my face. This is my file. And I'm going to go ahead and just say left control X to exit. I'm going to say Y that I do want to save the file. And for the file name, I'm going to leave it as file.txt and I'll press enter. Now, if I ls my directory, I have a file called file.txt. Now, I can nano that file again, and it's going to have this is my file inside of that particular file because that's what we put in there when we saved it. So we have something called file.txt. What we can do next, and the next command that I would probably talk to you about is the move command. So if I want to rename this file, I can use the move utility to not only move it from one location, one directory to another, but I can also rename with the move utility. So I can say move file.txt and let's call it new underscore name.txt. If I press ls, I now see instead of file.txt, I see new name.txt. And if I nano new name.txt, it's still the same file, just has a different name. Next, you should learn about the cp command or a way to copy files on a Linux file system. So I'm going to say cp and I'm going to say new file name to copied underscore file.txt. Press enter. And if I do ls, I now have two files in here. I can also do ll to get that in a list, or ls-l is probably an easier way to look at that. So I can see I have copied file and I have new name.txt. If I nano copied file, we'll see that we have this is my file. It's the same contents. It was just copied. Now let's talk about deleting files. We're going to use the rm or remove command to do this. So I'm going to clear the screen. I'll do ls-l and let's say rm. And actually, let's clear the screen. I just want to show you tab completion, how this can work. So I'm in my current users directory where I know the two files reside. I'll hit rm, I'll hit space, and I'll double tap tab. And what this is going to do is list every file that I could remove. Now, what we're looking for is copied file.txt. So I'll select it, or I can do this and right click, copy and paste. And I'm going to press C and tab, and that will autocomplete copied file.txt because that's the only file that starts with the C in this directory. If there was multiple, then I'd have to maybe type more of the name out before pressing tab. But we're just going to press enter and it's going to delete the file. So I'll type in ls-l. And what we have now is just new name.txt. We can also remove directories. We have to use -r to do that. We're not going to break this down, but you have to be really careful with the rm command because a lot of times the delete directories, you'll have to do -rf if there's contents inside of the directory. And let me just tell you that rm-rf can get you into a lot of trouble. So I would avoid using it while you're learning Linux. A better practice is to make a directory called trash or recycle bin or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to say mkdir, and we're going to call this trash, right? So if I ls, now I have a directory called trash, and I'll do ls-l. I have a directory called trash and a file called new name.txt. I know this is a directory because when I do ls-l, I see D as the first letter here. Again, this is the type of file that we're looking at. It would either be listed as a file, which is just a hyphen in this case, or a directory. And then the permissions, we're not going to break down octal and symbolic permissions in this video. It's just too complicated. But for now, just know that, hey, that has a D, so it's a directory. And if I wanted to delete files, what I would recommend for you to do is just say, instead of deleting a file or a directory, you want to move it into your trash directory. So I'm going to move new name into trash, right? And now I'll do ls -l, and I only have trash, and I can ls trash, and I'll see my file is inside of the trash directory. So if I want to delete everything in the trash directory, I can do rm, and I don't want to delete trash itself. I'm going to delete everything in trash. So I'll do trash asterisk. And these asterisks, I'm going to warn you, can get you into a lot of trouble. That's why we're doing this in a lab environment, because you don't want to delete the wrong set of files on Linux. It can be a real pain to recover from. But we're going to say remove everything inside of trash. Now, if I ls-l trash, I can see there's no files in there and I've emptied my sudo recycle bin. All right, so there's going to be times when we need to do things as an administrator. We talked about running commands as sudo. We can switch user as well. So if I want to switch to the root user, I can type in sudo su. And right away, what you're going to notice is it switches me over to the root user. And it still lists the server name, but the path now, it's not my home directory. I'm under Paul H's home directory. So if I want to get to my directory, I just type in cd and I do the colon and I do the tilde, and that will get me back to my user's home directory, which is actually /root. So it's a different path. One thing I want to point out right away is you'll notice there is a hash symbol here. This is not the $sign that we saw before. This means we are ready. The shell is ready to accept commands, but also we are in as the root user. That's a way to tell just besides seeing root over here on the left-hand side. What I want to do is cd back to /home/paulh, and we're going to nano a file. So nano root, let's just call this root file.txt. And let's just say this is a file created by root. And let's hit left control X and shift Y to save it. And I'll press enter to save it as root file.txt. If I ls-l, what we see is a root file.txt. And I'm going to go ahead and just type in exit and press enter. Now I'm back to my Paul H user in my home directory. I'll ls-l again, and we see the same file is there. Nothing unexpected here, right? But if we try to nano root file.txt, we're going to get an error saying that, hey, root file.txt is unwritable. And this is where we start to get in one of the most important things when it comes to working on Linux is file ownership and file permissions. I'm going to hit Control X to leave that since we cannot edit the file anyways because it's not owned by our user. If I look on the left-hand side, what we're going to see is it's owned by the user root and the group root. Again, we can't dive super into this, but that file is not editable by our user because it's not owned by our user. If we look at trash, we can see that our user owns that. Also, these permissions tell me you can use permission calculators, but this tells me that only the owner has read, write, and permissions, and everybody else, which is these last three, only have read permissions. So we need to do what is called chowning or chown to change the file to our user. So what I'm going to do is say sudo, because it's owned by root, I have to run this as sudo. And I'm going to say chown root. I'm going to chown this file to Paul H, and I'm going to do colon. So the user Paul H, that's this part. And then we're going to do the group Paul H. That's that part. So Paul H. And then the file is going to be root file.txt. I'll press enter. Now, if I do ls-l, that root file is now owned by Paul H, the user, and Paul H, the group. So if I try to nano that file now, I'm able to do that. And I can say, this is an update, and I can save the file. And if I use one of my favorite commands, cat, and I say root file.txt, I get an output saying this is the file created by root, and this is an update. I could also just nano the file and see that is there as well. So that's one thing that is important is that, if you cannot access a file, check the ownership and make sure that your user has access to the file or they own it, or they have the ability to edit the file. The file permissions may need to be updated. All right, let's talk about chmod or chmod. It's a command that allows you to change permissions of a file. When we had these permissions up here, what you'll notice is that it had restricted access, right? So the way that you change those permissions is by using the chmod or chmod command. So let's make a simple script, right? We're going to get a brief introduction to this. What I'm going to do is make a file called script.sh. And let's just say echo hello scripting world. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. So echo space and in quotation marks hello world. I'll hit left control X and I'll save the file. Now, if I ls-l, we have a script here, which is called script.sh, but we can't run it because its permissions does not have X. There's no execute anywhere in these permissions. So if I tried to say /script.sh, it's going to say permission denied. And that's because we don't have permissions execute. So the easiest way to do that is chmod plus X, and we're going to say script.sh. And what this is going to do, it's going to allow anybody to execute that script. So if I say ls-l now, all of our users have gotten this X permission, which means execute. So now I can do / and I can say script, and it's going to execute our script, which echoes hello scripting world. Now, again, I know this is going to be a little bit overwhelming. You're not going to understand everything that just happened there, but just keep in mind that you created a script. you made it executable and you ran the script. So dot slash sc, press tab, press enter, and we've run our first script, right? Pretty cool stuff. I would strongly recommend that you take a look at bash scripting, which is what we just did there, or shell scripting, and become familiar with it. The command that we put inside of that file, if I cat script, oops, let me hit Control A and type this in correctly. If we cat this, what we did is we did the echo command and we said hello scripting world. I can also just copy and paste that directly into my shell and it will do the same thing. Scripts are essentially taking commands that we type at the terminal and putting them in a specific order in a file, and then making that file executable, and then executing that file to get a desired result, right? And scripting is something you want to do when you find yourself doing a repetitive task over and over again. Okay, so let's talk about process management. So we have the PS command, which will show us processes. The most common way that I like to run this command is with PS space AUX and press enter. And that's going to give me a nice list of all of the applications that we're running here. Now I'm too zoomed in, so I need to zoom out. I'm going to clear my screen and run that command again. And that's going to give us more information about our services. Now you notice there's all kinds of problems with this. You know, if I zoom in, I get weird text wrapping and I have to scroll. So what I like to do is use the top command. So I'll hit top and I'll press enter. And what this is going to do is open a task manager-like experience. So here I have at the top my CPU usage. I can see how much memory I'm using and how much I have available. And I can see all of my processes, the process ID, who's running the process. Like I can see top here, for example, is being used by Paul H. And I can use the arrows to move around. So if I press the right arrow, I can scroll to the right and look at this information. I can also press the down arrow and go down through all the processes. You can also kill different processes if you'd like. But again, this is a way for you to gain insight into the performance of your server. So if I saw my CPU usage was at 90% or 80%, I would be a little bit concerned about maybe there's some software that's running that, you know, is slowing down my server. I may want to kill those processes using the kill command by saying kill and then the process ID listed here on the left. Or maybe my server just needs more processing power. You could find that out by just looking at the CPU usage and memory usage of each process. I'm going to press Q to quit that, and I'll clear the screen by typing clear and pressing enter. All right, so let's talk about the grep command. So grep is how you filter and search for different things on a Linux file system. And one of the most common ways you'll do this is by looking through log output. So if I try to cat /var/log and I say syslog, or I'm sorry, that is going to be, I'm going to double tap tab so I can see the list of files that are in here. And what we're looking for is syslog. So I'll press tab and enter. We get a whole bunch of output. Now let's say I want to find all the logs that are related to dbus daemon. So I can copy that and I can press the up arrow to get back in my command history. So I'm catting the entire syslog, but I'm going to say pipe. So I'm holding shift and hitting the / on my keyboard. That gives us the pipe command. So take that and pipe that to grep. And we're going to do in quotation marks, I'll paste that dbus-daemon. If I press enter, that will give me a filtered output of the syslog that only shows me every line that has the keyword or the phrase dbus-daemon. I can also do grep, and I can say grep for dbus daemon and then press the file path. So var/log/syslog, press enter, and I'll get the same type of output. So you can either pipe output into grep, or you can just grep for things directly. So there may come times where you need to search a Linux file system for a particular file. And let's use the syslog, for example. Maybe you don't remember where that's located on the file system. Well, we can use the find utility to get that information. So what I'm going to do is type in find, and we're going to specify the path that we want to start the search. If I have no idea where to start, I'm just going to say /, which is the root of the Linux file system hierarchy. And we're going to see a lot of permission denied. So let's just run this as with sudo privileges. So I'll hit the up arrow, Control A to jump to the beginning of my output. I'll type in sudo and I'll press enter. This lets us run the search without getting permission denied. And this permission denied is because we're searching the entire file system where our user Paul H does not have permissions to go poking around, right? But if we run that as sudo, we're essentially doing it as a root user who has access to the entire file system. So what I can see right away is what I'm looking for is /var/log/syslog. So I could tail, and I'm starting to throw a bunch of commands out here. Just take it or leave it. This is the tail command that allows you to follow or get the trailing output of a file, or you can do -F, which will follow the file. and I can paste in that directory, press enter. And every time a new message gets posted to this log, it will be output on my screen here. So I can press enter. I'll do this all the time where I'll press enter so I can see when new messages come through, that information will be posted here to the log. So I'm just going to hit left Control C to exit that, and I'm going to hit clear. All right. So the last thing I want to talk to you about are the directories that are on the Linux file system, and just a brief introduction into what they are and what they mean. Now, Linux has a file system hierarchy standard. I'm not going to talk to you about every directory because that's going to bore you to death, frankly, and you probably don't need to know it. But if it's your first day, if I'm teaching you on the job, this is how Linux works. These are probably the 5 or so directories that I'm going to talk to you about. Now, the first thing you need to understand when it comes to Linux, the Linux file system hierarchy, is that it's a little bit different than Windows. Windows uses drive letters to represent physical storage devices, where Linux will mount everything under the slash or the root directory in a hierarchical manner. This means everything that you're going to find, all your storage devices, all your removable media will be somewhere under slash. So I can cd to slash by just doing cd slash. And if I ls-l this directory, these are all the folders that I have in files under my root directory. So this is my root directory where all of my storage devices and all my files on my Linux system will be listed underneath. So we have this bin directory. So if I do cd/bin, press enter, inside of this are all my binary files that I have, or my applications essentially that are installed on my computer. Now let's ls-l root again, and we have the etc directory. Now, etc. or /etc is where you're going to find most of your configuration files for the server software that you install on this Linux system. So if you install Nginx, for example, you want to make a configuration change to that web server, that proxy server, it's going to be under /etc/nginx. This is your first place to look for configuration files of server software that you install on your Linux server. We have /home, which you've already looked at, but if I ls/home, that's where my user's home directory is located. And for every user that we add to our Linux server, you're going to find their files under /home. Of course, the exception of this is the root user, which is listed under /root. So if I look here, I'll see a directory called root, which is not to be confused with slash or the root directory of our file system, right? So sometimes we'll refer to slash as the root directory. That is not the same as the root user's home directory, which is /root. If I do that, you'll see I get permission denied because I don't own that directory, right? That is owned by root. Okay, now the other directory I want to make sure that you understand, we've already looked at this a little bit, is the var directory. So if I ls/var, what I can see is there's several directories under here. This is where you'll find your variable data that's expected to change, to include log files. So what we looked at earlier was if I ls/var/log, this is a directory that you'll need to frequently visit. We were looking at the syslog, but if you install different software, again, I'll use Nginx as an example, you'll find logs for that server located in the /var/log directory. So anytime you need to troubleshoot a system or service or an application, you'll probably want to look inside of the /var/log directory. Okay, so that's going to wrap up this video on an introduction to Linux distributions, specifically with a strong focus on the CLI. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in more Linux training, I highly recommend that you create a free account at serveracademy.com. Check out our Linux fundamentals course, and then you can move on to our Linux server administration course, which covers all of these things in much more detail. And it's in bite-sized small lectures where you can mark each lecture as complete. You can track your progress through the curriculum, and there's IT labs that launch in your browser that you can interact with. There will be steps that you'll need to complete that are evaluated. We have an AI chatbot that can see inside of your IT labs and give you feedback and help you work through different issues as you're learning to administrate Linux servers. So I highly recommend you check that out. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel and support me by giving me a like and dropping a comment. Again, please comment your most common or must know commands, as that's really going to help out everybody else who's watching the video. All right, but that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.